He acted asleep to test the maid's daughter, but froze in shock at her actions. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss stories that will move you, inspire you, and make you reflect about life. And tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video right now? I love seeing where our family of viewers is growing around the world. Now let's start. Darkness draped over the colossal mansion, its silence broken only by the faint ticking of an antique clock in the hallway. The chandelier lights had already dimmed, leaving long shadows stretching across the marble floors. In a lavish bedroom, a man lay perfectly still on an oversized bed, his chest rising and falling in slow, calculated breaths. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. No, this was not a night of rest. It was a night of suspicion, a night of testing. He had lived too many years surrounded by betrayal. Business partners who shook his hand only to stab him in the back later. Family members who smiled at him while secretly plotting to take his fortune. Women who whispered love into his ear while counting the zeros in his bank account. In a life where money was both shield and curse, trust had become a fragile, nearly extinct thing. And now, even in his own home, his doubts had turned against the people who had once seemed untouchable. From beneath his lowered lashes, he caught the faintest flicker of movement near the door. A shadow, small, hesitant. The sound of a soft footstep against the polished floor echoed in his ears like thunder. He tightened his jaw, but remained still, every muscle trained not to betray that he was awake. The door creaked open, revealing a timid silhouette, slender, almost fragile. She moved carefully, as if afraid the silence itself might shatter. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her breathing quick, uneven. She glanced toward the bed where he slept, her eyes carrying both caution and something else, something he couldn't yet name. Behind her, another shadow appeared, this one broader, slower, with the quiet grace of someone used to tiptoeing through the corridors of wealth without ever belonging to it. The second figure placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, whispering something inaudible but firm. The girl nodded, taking another cautious step into the room. He lay there, still as stone, his thoughts sharp as knives. What will they do? He wondered. Will they finally reveal what they truly are? Will they steal? Will they betray? His heart beat heavy, each second a hammer against his ribs. He remembered the warnings his old friend once gave him. Never trust those who serve you. They smile because they need you, not because they love you. He had dismissed it once, long ago, but now the words crawled back into his mind like poison. The girl approached the bedside, her steps trembling yet determined. Her eyes lingered on his face, eyes that had seen the cruelty of life far too young. She raised a hand, hesitating in the air just above him, as if fighting with a decision she had already made. At that very moment, the air in the room grew heavier. The silence was deafening, the tension suffocating. He wanted to open his eyes, to catch her in the act, to confirm what his instincts screamed at him. But something stopped him, a chill in his chest, a question in his mind. And then, she leaned closer, lips parting to whisper words that froze him more than any betrayal could. Words he hadn't expected, words he wasn't prepared to hear. But what she said and what she did next would change everything. The room was still cloaked in silence, broken only by the girl's shallow breaths as she stood by the bedside. Her words, whispered so faintly, were carried away by the darkness before he could fully grasp them. But the tone, soft, almost prayerful, etched itself into his mind like fire on stone. His fists curled beneath the blanket, his heart thundering not from anger, but from the haunting question of why. For a moment, he was pulled backward into the corridors of his memory. Memories he hated, memories that were both weapon and wound. Years ago, when his empire was still rising, he had already known betrayal. A trusted partner had forged contract behind his back, stealing millions. A cousin had tried to declare him unfit, hoping to seize control of his assets. He had survived all of it, but each scar left behind something worse than pain. It left suspicion. Suspicion so deep that it stained the way he looked at everyone, even the innocent. That suspicion was now projected onto the woman who had cleaned his home for years. The one who had polished his marble floors until they shone like mirrors, who had washed his linen sheets with care, who had bowed her head in gratitude every time he handed her the envelope of her wages. She had always seemed loyal, humble, invisible even. Yet loyalty was a costume many had worn before stabbing him in the back. He had seen too many masks in his life to believe hers wasn't one. And then there was her daughter, a child he had watched grow within these walls, though always from a distance. The girl had once toddled through his gardens, chasing butterflies, her laughter spilling across the hedges like sunshine. She had drawn pictures on scraps of paper with crayons her mother had bought from the cheapest store in town. Sometimes she'd leave those little drawings on the kitchen counter, shyly, as if hoping someone would notice. He had noticed, but never said a word. He told himself it was because he didn't have time for such trivial things. But in truth, he feared that kindness would bind him to them in ways money could not sever. Still, as the years passed, the girl became a young woman, modest, quiet, with the same eyes as her mother. Deep, tired, but carrying something no fortune could buy, dignity. And dignity, he often told himself, was just another word people used until life crushed them into something else. That night, suspicion had reached its peak. He remembered overhearing faint whispers in the hallway a few days earlier. The mother and daughter talking in hushed tones, stopping immediately when they realized he was near. The sound had ignited old fires in his mind. What were they plotting? What secrets were they keeping from him? It was then that he had decided. He would test them. He would give them a chance to prove what he already believed, that no one, no matter how meek, could resist temptation when fortune lay within reach. And so, tonight, he lay in his bed, feigning sleep, waiting for their masks to fall. But now, with the girl standing above him, her lips whispering words he could barely catch, the certainty he had clung to began to fracture. He could not dismiss the trembling sincerity in her voice. He could not ignore the way her hand hovered, not to steal, not to harm, but to comfort. And then, her mother's voice cut through the stillness. "Don't wake him," she whispered urgently from the shadows near the door. "He works too much. Let him rest." The girl froze, lowering her hand. Her eyes glistened in the dim light, and she nodded silently. Instead of reaching for the wall on the nightstand, instead of searching the drawers as he expected, she bent down slowly, carefully adjusting the blanket that had slipped from his shoulder. With a tenderness that did not belong in a heart corrupted by greed, she tucked it beneath his chin, as though protecting him from the cold of the night. The man's throat tightened, though he dared not move. His chest burned with shame he could not yet name. The mother's footsteps retreated, guiding her daughter out of the room. But before leaving, the girl cast one last glance back at the bed. In her eyes there was no malice, no hunger for wealth, no schemes. Only something that pierced him deeper than any betrayal ever had: compassion. And in that moment, though he lay still with eyes shut, he felt as though he had been the one exposed. But if compassion was real, then what were those whispers he had heard days ago? What secret did they carry that they did not want him to know? The question gnawed at him as the door clicked softly shut behind them, leaving him alone in the darkness once more. The house was silent again, but inside the man's chest, storms brewed. He lay in his bed, body frozen, eyes closed, as though sleep might come and erase what he had just witnessed. But it didn't. Instead, his mind wandered back to the moments he had ignored, the small pieces of life lived by the two people who had worked under his roof for so many years. He remembered a rainy morning long ago when he had walked past the kitchen on his way to a meeting. The girl, back then barely 10 years old, was sitting on a stool, swinging her legs, clutching a piece of bread as though it were a feast. Her mother stood by the sink, humming softly as she scrubbed dishes. They hadn't noticed him, not until his shoes clicked on the marble floor. The mother had spun around quickly, bowing her head in respect, apologizing for the girl being in the kitchen at all. He hadn't said anything. He had only walked away, his face cold, though something in the child's shy smile had tugged at him. Back then, he didn't care. Or maybe he didn't want to care. Caring was dangerous. Caring meant letting people into the fortress he had built around himself. And once they were inside, betrayal was easier. Yet he couldn't forget the sound of the girl's laugh when she thought no one was listening. Light, innocent, free. The kind of laugh no amount of money could buy. Now, as the hours dragged on that sleepless night, he realized how little he actually knew about them. They had lived within his walls for years, but their stories remained locked away, invisible, dismissed as background to his empire. He had never asked where they came from, never wondered why they stayed so long. To him, they were like furniture, present, useful, replaceable. But tonight, the whisper of a prayer over his sleeping form had unsettled everything. What she said, he replayed the sound in his head. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't greed. It had been something softer, something almost sacred. A plea, a hope. His chest ached, but he swallowed it down and turned onto his side, careful not to make a sound. He would find out the truth. He would peel back the layers he had ignored for too long. The next morning arrived with the faint glow of dawn seeping through the curtains. The mansion woke slowly, the hum of the staff beginning their duties, the clink of porcelain in the kitchen, the sound of footsteps echoing in polished halls. He descended from his room later than usual, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp, observing everything. From the corner of the dining room, he noticed the woman and her daughter. The mother's hands were cracked, reddened by years of harsh soaps and endless scrubbing. She moved quietly, her back slightly bent, as though the weight of life had permanently curved her posture. Her daughter stood beside her, folding napkins into neat triangles, careful, precise. He watched them with a cold stare, but inside, a different storm raged. He wanted to hate them, to catch them in some flaw, some act of dishonesty that would justify the suspicion gnawing at him. But all he saw was humility, movements too genuine to be rehearsed. And then came the moment that unsettled him most. The mother whispered something to her daughter again, just like she had in the hallway days before. The girl glanced at him briefly, then lowered her eyes and nodded. The same secretive tones, the same silence when he was near. His suspicion flared again. Were they hiding? Later that day, curiosity gnawed at him until he could no longer bear it. He followed them discreetly, his polished shoes softened against the thick carpet. The whispers led him toward the small service quarters tucked away at the edge of the mansion. The air grew colder there, the golden glow of chandeliers fading into the dim flicker of a single bulb. Through the narrow crack of the door, he saw them. The girl sat on a thin mattress, her knees pulled to her chest. In her hands, she clutched a worn notebook, its cover faded, its pages frayed. She was writing, her head bent low, lips moving as if reading the words aloud to herself. Her mother sat beside her, sewing patches onto an old dress, the needle glinting faintly in the dim light. Their conversation was hushed, their tones heavy with seriousness. "Not yet," the mother said softly. "We must wait for the right moment. He wouldn't understand. Not someone like him." The girl frowned, her eyes shining. "But Mama, what if it's too late?" The man stiffened, his jaw tightening. "What wouldn't I understand? Too late for what?" His suspicion reignited, mixing with unease. The kindness he had witnessed the night before clashed violently with the secrecy unfolding before him now. For the first time in years, he felt trapped in a contradiction. Were they truly loyal and humble, or were they weaving a scheme behind his back, hidden beneath layers of innocence? His heart pounded. He leaned closer, straining to hear every word. But before he could catch more, the mother rose, closing the notebook and placing a protective hand over it as though guarding treasure. And in that moment, the door creaked under his weight. Both of them froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. The girl's wide eyes locked onto the faint shadow at the door, and he realized he had been seen. The silence was heavy. It stretched like a taut rope between the cracked door and the two figures inside the room. The girl's eyes, wide and sharp, pierced through the dim light and caught him. It wasn't the gaze of a child startled by shadows. It was something else, an awareness far beyond her age. Her hand tightened around the notebook, pulling it against her chest as though her heartbeat could guard its secrets. The mother rose slowly, her movements measured, her sewing needle still in her hand. Her eyes darted to the door, narrowing as they adjusted to the faint silhouette of the man standing just beyond the threshold. She did not speak. Not yet. The pause was long enough for him to feel the weight of their suspicion pressing back on him. A mirror of his own doubts returned with equal force. His breath was steady, but inside the storm raged. He was the master of this house, the one who commanded obedience with a single word. Yet here, in this cramped and poorly lit service room, he felt strangely unwelcome. The air seemed heavier, charged with something he couldn't name. At last, he pushed the door open fully, the hinges creaking like a scream in the silence. The girl flinched, her shoulders curling inward, her knuckles white against the worn notebook. Her mother stepped in front of her protectively, her tired eyes burning with quiet defiance. "What are you hiding?" His voice was calm, low, but it carried the steel edge of authority sharpened by years of being obeyed. Neither of them answered immediately. The girl's lips parted, but her mother placed a firm hand on her shoulder, silencing her. The woman's chin lifted ever so slightly, a gesture that surprised him. She had always bowed, always lowered her gaze, always remained invisible. But now, standing between him and her daughter, she seemed taller, stronger, like a wall built from something unbreakable. "There is nothing here that belongs to you," the mother finally said. Her tone was respectful, but resolute. The words struck him deeper than he expected. Nothing that belongs to him. Everything in this house, every object, every coin, every breath of air under its roof, he had bought, built, or earned. How dare she speak, as though some corner of it was outside his reach? His eyes dropped to the notebook, still pressed against the girl's chest. "Then why hide it?" he pressed. The girl's eyes flashed with a mixture of fear and stubborn courage. For the first time, she spoke, her voice trembling yet clear. "Because it's mine." Those 3 words landed with unexpected force. So simple, so small. But the way she said them, with trembling hands and a heart that refused to surrender, made him pause. Her mother's hand tightened on her shoulder, a silent warning. But the girl, emboldened, continued. "You wouldn't understand." The phrase clawed at him. "You wouldn't understand." It echoed the mother's whisper from before. The same words, repeated like a locked door slamming in his face. He straightened, his eyes narrowing, suspicion battling against something more dangerous, curiosity. He took a step forward, his polished shoes tapping against the worn floorboards of the service room. The contrast between his tailored suit and the threadbare walls of their living quarters was stark. It was like 2 worlds colliding in a single space. The girl clutched the notebook tighter, her breathing uneven, but she did not retreat. Her gaze held his, fearful, yes, but with a thread of defiance woven through it. For a brief moment, he saw her not as the child of his servant, not as a possible thief or schemer, but as someone fighting desperately to protect something fragile and sacred. "What is inside?" he demanded, his voice softer now, though the command in it remained. The girl's lips trembled. She lowered her gaze, pressing her forehead against the notebook, as though hiding it even from her own eyes. "Dreams," she whispered. "Things you wouldn't care about." The words sliced through him in a way he didn't anticipate. Dreams. A word he hadn't spoken in years. A word that felt foreign on his tongue. His life had become about numbers, contracts, empires. Dreams were for the young, for the naive, for the poor who needed illusions to survive. And yet, the way she said it, so protective, so desperate, unsettled him. For a long moment, the room was silent again. He could hear only the ticking of his wristwatch, each second pressing into him like a reminder of time lost. He wanted to demand the notebook, to rip it from her hands and expose its contents. He wanted proof that his suspicion was right, that even innocence carried hidden schemes. But something stopped him, something in her trembling voice, something in the way her mother stood, shielding her not out of rebellion, but out of love. He turned abruptly, his coat brushing against the doorframe as he stepped back into the corridor. His voice was cold, final. Keep your secrets. For now. He walked away, the echo of his footsteps fading through the long hallway. But no matter how far he went, the words lingered, clawing at him. Dreams. Things you wouldn't care about. For the first time in years, he felt doubt. Not about them, but about himself. And he knew this was only... The night after that confrontation was long and merciless. The mansion, though filled with gold and marble, felt strangely hollow. The man sat alone in his study, the amber glow of a single lamp falling across stacks of ledgers and unopened letters. He was surrounded by symbols of power, paintings worth millions, a desk carved from rare mahogany, a globe with inlaid gemstones, but none of them gave him comfort. None of them answered the question clawing at his chest. Dreams. Things you wouldn't care about. The girl's voice echoed in his mind, tormenting him. He wanted to dismiss it, to shove it away like all the other sentiments he had long buried. But it lingered. It gnawed at him. And worse, it pulled him into a place he had avoided for decades, curiosity about the lives of others. For hours, he sat there, his whiskey untouched, his pen still in his hand. Eventually, exhaustion overtook suspicion, and he drifted into uneasy sleep. The following morning, he awoke earlier than usual. Something inside him refused to let the matter rest. He needed answers, not from their lips, but from their lives. And if they would not show him, he would uncover them himself. He moved silently through the mansion, his steps deliberate, his gaze sharp. The staff kept their distance, as they always did, lowering their eyes, bowing slightly as he passed. But his focus was elsewhere. He found himself again outside the service quarters, the small room where the girl and her mother lived. The door was closed, but faint sounds drifted from inside, stitching, perhaps, or the creak of the old bed. He did not knock. Instead, he lingered in the hallway, his hand grazing the doorframe, his jaw tight. He hated the feeling of hesitation. He had never hesitated in his life, not in business, not in war with his rivals. And yet here, before the room of two women who owned nothing, he felt uncertain. Later that day, opportunity presented itself. The mother and daughter left the mansion on foot, carrying a small basket between them. He watched them from the upstairs window, his sharp eyes following their every step as they disappeared down the long road into town. Without wasting time, he moved. He descended into the service quarters, his presence filling the narrow corridor. The air was different here, colder, poorer, stripped of the fragrance and luxury that perfumed his own chambers. It was a place meant for survival, not comfort. The small room was humble to the point of cruelty. Two narrow beds pressed against the wall, a single wooden wardrobe with one door hanging off its hinge, a basin with a cracked pitcher, and a thin rug faded by years of wear. It was a stark reminder of the worlds divided within the same roof, one of opulence, the other of necessity. And then he saw it. On the small bedside table lay the notebook, the same one the girl had clutched so desperately to her chest. Its cover was frayed, its corners bent. The temptation burned within him. His hand hovered above it, his pulse quickening. He knew this was wrong, that to read it was to trespass on something private. But his suspicion, his need for control, his obsession with uncovering hidden truths overpowered the flicker of conscience. He picked it up. The first page was filled with drawings, childish at first, but full of color. Houses, fields, a sun beaming over a small figure holding hands with a taller one. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, the kind of letters a young child practices with determination. He turned the pages. Each one told a story, not a betrayal, but a survival. There were lists of groceries written in clumsy handwriting. Eggs, bread, milk, next to small calculations, as though she had learned to stretch coins into meals. There were sketches of dresses, drawn with a hopeful hand, labeled with words like someday and for mama. There were journal entries, short and broken, but painfully honest. Mama says we'll be okay, but she works too hard. I want to help her. I want to grow up fast. Another entry later. Today I heard him shouting on the phone. He didn't see me. He never sees me. I wonder if he knows my name. His throat tightened. His hand trembled slightly as he turned the page. One entry stopped him cold. If I ever had a chance, I would thank him. Not for the money, not for the house, but for letting us stay here. Mama says we must always be grateful, even if he never looks at us. She says he is a good man deep down, just alone. Maybe she is right. I hope she is right. The words blurred before his eyes. He shut the notebook abruptly, his chest heavy, his mind a battlefield of emotions he hadn't felt in years. But before he could place it back exactly as it was, a sound cut through the silence, the sharp click of the door. He spun around. There she was, the girl, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide, her lips parted in shock. The basket she had carried fell from her hands, apples rolling across the floor. She froze, staring at the notebook in his hands. The betrayal in her young face pierced him deeper than any blade ever could. Her voice, when it came, was small but fierce. You had no right. And in that instant, for the first time in his life, the man who commanded empires felt like the one standing guilty. The silence that followed her words was unbearable. The girl stood frozen in the doorway, her small shoulders tense, her chest rising and falling with the quick rhythm of her breath. The apple she had dropped rolled lazily across the wooden floor, one coming to rest against the tip of his polished shoe. But neither of them moved to pick them up. Their eyes were locked, and in that exchange, the air became heavier than iron. You had no right, she repeated, this time louder, her voice cracking. Not from weakness, but from the weight of betrayal. The man's throat felt dry. He had commanded boardrooms filled with cutthroats, had silenced entire halls with a single glare, but now, under the accusing gaze of a 14-year-old girl, he felt smaller. His hand tightened around the notebook, not in defiance, but in shame. For the first time in years, he could not summon the strength to defend himself with arrogance or power. I needed to know, he said finally, his voice low, hoarse. Her eyes widened, burning with anger. Needed to know what? That we are poor? That we have nothing? That mama works until her hands bleed while you sit in your big chair, counting money. Each word was like a dagger. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. The girl's tears welled, but she refused to let them fall. She stood tall, trembling but firm. At that very moment, another figure appeared in the doorway. The mother. She froze at the sight, the notebook in his hands, her daughter's face flushed with anger, the apples scattered like spilled secrets across the floor. Her expression hardened. What have you done? The man straightened, instinctively adopting the posture of control, but his voice betrayed the conflict within. You read it, the mother interrupted, her voice a mixture of disbelief and fury. You invaded her dreams, her only escape. She stepped forward, placing herself between her daughter and him, her arms spreading slightly as though shielding the girl from an enemy. The girl clutched her mother's arm, whispering through clenched teeth, "Mama, he was in my things. He doesn't trust us." The mother's face was pale, her eyes blazing. For years, she had endured humiliation silently, bowing her head, swallowing every bitter taste of inequality for the sake of survival. But this was different. Her daughter was sacred, her daughter's innocence untouchable. "Do you not have enough, sir?" Her voice trembled, but her words were sharp. "You have more money than you could ever spend, more land than you could ever walk. You have power over everyone who steps into this house. But it wasn't enough, was it? You had to take the only thing my daughter has." Her words, her hope. He flinched, though his face tried to remain composed. He wanted to say he hadn't meant harm, that suspicion had driven him, that his entire life had been one endless parade of betrayal. But even in his own ears, those excuses sounded hollow. The girl stepped out from behind her mother, her fists clenched. "Do you know what it feels like to have nothing? To write about dresses you will never wear, about places you will never see, just so you can believe for one moment that life could be more than hunger and cleaning floors." He could not answer. Her words dug into him like claws. The mother bent down, picking up the fallen apples, her hands shaking. She placed them back in the basket without looking at him. "We asked for nothing more than the chance to survive. We've never stolen from you. We've never betrayed you. And yet you look at us as if we're criminals." Her voice broke then, softer. "Do you know how humiliating that is? To be faithful for years, to raise my daughter under your roof with dignity, only to find out you see us as threats, as parasites." Her words stripped him bare. For a moment, he saw himself reflected not in the gilded mirrors of his mansion, but in their eyes, cold, suspicious, cruel. The fortress he had built for mistrust was crumbling, brick by brick, under the weight of their pain. He tried to speak, but the word hung in the air like a broken promise. The girl stepped closer, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She extended her hand, palm open, trembling. "Give it back." He looked down at the notebook in his hand. The leather was worn, the edges frayed, but it felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of her soul. Slowly, hesitantly, he extended it toward her. She snatched it from his grasp, clutching it tightly against her chest, as though reclaiming a piece of herself that had been stolen. "You may have everything in this world," she whispered fiercely, "but you will never own this." And with that, she turned and buried her face in her mother's embrace. The woman held her tightly, glaring at him over her daughter's shoulder, a glare filled not with fear, but with quiet strength. The man stood there, his chest heavy, shame coiling around him like chains. For the first time in decades, he felt powerless, not because of money lost, but because he had been shown a truth he couldn't escape. His wealth had blinded him to humanity. He left the room without a word, the sound of the girl's muffled sobs following him down the hall like ghosts. But as he retreated into the cavernous emptiness of his mansion, one thought echoed louder than all the rest. If they're truly innocent, if they're truly loyal, then I am the one who has been wrong all along. And that realization terrified him more than betrayal ever could. The mansion had never felt so suffocating. Its high ceilings and gilded chandeliers, once symbols of triumph, now mocked him with their cold emptiness. The man walked through the endless corridors, his steps echoing back at him like accusations. Every portrait that lined the walls, of ancestors, of businessmen, of himself, seemed to stare down at him with silent judgment. He had built a fortress out of marble and steel, out of suspicion and distance, but tonight that fortress felt more like a prison. He entered his study and closed the door behind him, leaning heavily against it. For a long time, he stood there, staring at the shadows stretching across the room. His thoughts twisted violently inside him. He had read the notebook. He had crossed a line, and the look in the girl's eyes, the betrayal, the fire, the wounded pride, burned into him more deeply than any insult or attack he had ever endured in the world of power. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hand trembling just slightly. He took a sip, but the burn in his throat couldn't drown the burn in his chest. He sat at his desk, staring at the untouched papers, the contracts waiting for his signature, the numbers dancing across spreadsheets. All of it felt meaningless. What was the use of empires if a child's words could unravel him? He thought of the girl's mother, how she had stood tall, how her voice had cut through him with dignity. He had always considered her invisible, a shadow moving in the background of his grand life. But tonight she had shown him a strength he could not ignore. She had accused him, not with malice, but with truth. And the truth was heavier than any burden he had carried. How many others have I crushed beneath my mistrust? He wondered bitterly. How many loyal hands have I dismissed? How many sincere hearts have I ignored? Because I chose suspicion over faith. He closed his eyes, and memories surged unbidden. There was the secretary from his early years, the one who had worked tirelessly by his side, who had refused bribes and stood loyal during the company's darkest days. He had accused her once of leaking information, and though it had been proven false, she had resigned in tears. He had never apologized. There was the old chauffeur who had driven him for 2 decades, who had missed only one day of work when his wife was dying. The man had asked for an advance on his salary for medical bills, and he had denied it coldly, convinced it was a trick. The chauffeur had left without a word, his grief swallowed by humiliation. And then there was his own brother. The memory hit him hardest. His brother had once come to him, desperate, asking for help to save his failing business. Instead of seeing the plea of family, he had seen only the shadow of greed. He had refused, accusing him of trying to use the family name for gain. Weeks later, his brother had gone bankrupt. They had never spoken again. The shame was suffocating. His entire life, he had worn suspicion like armor. It had kept him safe, yes, but at what cost? He had pushed away everyone, family, friends, allies, until all that was left was wealth and walls. And now, the mirror of that suspicion had turned toward the mother and daughter who had served faithfully under his roof. He had projected onto them the sins of others, the betrayals of his past. But what had he found instead? Not theft, not greed, not deceit. Dreams. Dreams written by a girl who had nothing, yet held more dignity than all the suits he had ever shaken hands with. His glass trembled in his hand. He set it down, staring blankly at the amber liquid. He thought of her words again. You may have everything in this world, but you will never own this. She was right. For the first time in his life, someone had told him a truth he couldn't bend with money, couldn't silence with power, and it left him shaken, raw, exposed. The following day, he tried to mask it. At breakfast, he sat at the head of the long dining table, as he always did. The silverware gleamed, the china was flawless, but the food turned to ash in his mouth. Across the hall, he glimpsed them, the mother and daughter, moving quietly, avoiding his gaze. Their silence was louder than words. The girl didn't enter the room. She stayed close to the kitchen, her notebook hidden under her arm. He watched from the corner of his eye as she bent her head close to the paper, writing furiously, her lips moving as though she whispered to herself. He wanted to know what she was writing now, what words filled those fragile pages after last night's betrayal. But he also knew he had lost the right to ask. Later that evening, when the staff retired, he did something he had never done before. He followed them, not openly, but from a distance, slipping into the shadowed corners of his own mansion. He watched as the mother and daughter left the house again, carrying a basket, walking down the road toward town. This time, he did not stay behind. He took his car, a sleek black vehicle that purred like a predator, and followed at a distance, his eyes fixed on them. Through narrow streets, he watched them enter a small market. The mother haggled gently with a vendor over the price of vegetables, her voice weary but polite. The daughter lingered by the side, counting coins carefully, her lips pressed tight as though she knew every coin mattered. They bought so little, a few apples, a loaf of bread, a bundle of carrots. He frowned. He paid them wages, yes, but clearly not enough for comfort. Was this what his suspicion had blinded him to all these years? That while he lived in gold and marble, they struggled to stretch pennies into meals. He followed them further, staying hidden, as they walked into a narrow alley lined with brick walls. They entered a small, dimly lit shop. He parked nearby, slipping out to watch through the dusty window. Inside, the girl approached a counter stacked with books, secondhand, worn, their covers faded. She ran her fingers reverently along the spines, her eyes lighting up in a way he had never seen. She picked one up, opened it carefully, and smiled. The mother approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. She whispered something, too far for him to hear, but he saw the girl's lips curve into a faint, hopeful smile. The mother handed a few coins to the shopkeeper, and the girl hugged the book to her chest like treasure. The man stood outside, rooted, his chest heavy. This was the secret. This was what they whispered about. Not betrayal, not greed, not schemes. Books, dreams, a hunger not for wealth, but for knowledge, for a future brighter than the one carved by poverty. He leaned back against the cold wall of the alley, closing his eyes as the truth struck him harder than any betrayal ever had. For the first time in decades, the fortress of suspicion cracked, and light began to pour through. The little bell above the shop door jingled as the mother and daughter stepped back onto the cobblestone street, the girl still clutching her worn book like a priceless jewel. The man remained hidden in the shadows, his sharp eyes never leaving them. He told himself he was only observing, only gathering proof of their intentions, but deep down he knew the truth. He was searching for redemption in their simplicity for a fragment of honesty that he had long forgotten existed. The narrow street bustled with life. Vendors shouted prices over baskets of fruit and bolts of fabric. Children darted between stalls, laughter mingling with the chatter of the crowd. Yet amidst the noise, the mother and daughter moved quietly like ghosts. Their clothes were plain, their steps modest, their presence nearly invisible compared to the colorful chaos around them. But invisibility did not protect them. As they passed a butcher's stall, a group of young women, draped in expensive fabrics and adorned with gaudy jewelry, spotted them. Their painted lips curved into cruel smiles. One of them, tall and haughty, stepped forward, blocking their path. "Well, if it isn't the maid and her little shadow," she sneered, loud enough for others to hear. Her companions giggled behind their gloved hands. The mother lowered her head, clutching the basket tighter. The girl pressed her new book against her chest, her jaw tightening. She didn't speak. She had learned long ago that silence was often safer. But the wealthy woman wasn't finished. She tilted her head, her eyes glinting with mockery. "Tell me, child, what do you carry there? Another rag to scribble nonsense in? You know, no matter how much you write, you'll never leave the dust of your mother's broom behind." The laughter that followed was sharp, slicing through the air. Passers-by slowed, some smirking, others pretending not to see. The girl's cheeks burned, but she didn't move. Her fingers dug into the edges of the book, holding it tighter, as though it were her shield. The mother straightened slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Leave us be. We are not here to cause trouble." The woman's smirk deepened. "Not here to cause trouble? You cause trouble just by existing. Do you think people like us want you here, mingling in the same market, breathing the same air? You should remember your place." At that, one of her companions plucked an apple from the maid's basket and tossed it carelessly onto the ground. The red fruit rolled into the mud, trampled instantly by a passing boot. Another reached for the book in the girl's arms, but she twisted away, clutching it desperately. "Don't touch it," she cried, her voice breaking for the first time. The laughter grew louder, crueler. From across the street, unseen, the man stood frozen. His blood boiled, his fists tightening at his sides. He had witnessed greed, betrayal, even open hatred in the world of power. But this was different. This was cruelty for the sake of cruelty. And it was being inflicted upon two people who had done nothing but serve with humility. The girl's voice reached him again, trembling but defiant. "You may laugh at me, but you cannot take this. This is mine." Her words struck him with the same force as the night before, when she had told him he would never own her dreams. The echo of her courage against humiliation pierced the armor he had built around his heart. The mother bent down, picking up the trampled apple, her fingers stained with mud. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply brushed it off, placed it back into the basket, and guided her daughter away with quiet dignity. The crowd parted reluctantly, some whispering, others chuckling, but neither of them bowed to the mockery. They kept walking, heads held just high enough to show they would not break. The man's chest tightened. For the first time in years, rage surged within him. Not the cold rage he used to crush competitors, but a fiery, protective anger. His instinct screamed to step forward, to tear those women down with the sheer weight of his name and fortune. He could silence them with a single word, make them crawl, make them beg. But he didn't move. He couldn't. Not yet. To reveal himself now would be to expose that he had been following them, spying like a thief in the night. And worse, it would look as though he was swooping in to play savior, when what they had just displayed was far greater than his intervention. Because in their silence, in their refusal to crumble, the mother and daughter had shown something no wealth could manufacture: resilience. Still, the anger seared him from within, leaving his jaw clenched and his hands trembling. As they disappeared back into the crowd, he remained behind, his breath uneven. For the first time, he realized that the test he had staged, pretending to sleep, watching to see if they would betray him, was not their test. It was his, and he had failed. He had misjudged them, doubted them, wounded them. And yet, even humiliated by the world, they carried themselves with more dignity than he had ever managed. That night, as the mansion lights glowed against the darkness, he returned home before them, pacing the marble floors like a restless ghost. His reflection in the glass windows looked unfamiliar, haunted, ashamed. When they finally arrived, slipping quietly into the servants' quarters, he listened to the faint sound of the girl's voice through the walls. She was reading aloud from her new book, her tone filled with wonder, as though the outside world hadn't just tried to crush her spirit. The sound broke him. He sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in decades, he whispered words he had nearly forgotten how to form. I was wrong, and the question followed, heavier than stone. But how do I make it right? The following days passed with a weight that seemed to press down on every corner of the mansion. For years, the man had lived under the comfort of distance. Staff obeyed, silence reigned, and no one dared pierce the walls of his solitude. But now, every sound of their footsteps, every whisper exchange between the mother and daughter echoed in his mind, louder than the ticking of clocks or the chiming of chandeliers. At breakfast, he sat at the head of the long table, a silver service laid out before him, plates of food untouched. He barely noticed the butler hovering nearby, nor the maids arranging flowers. His eyes flickered instead toward the far doorway, where the girl sometimes appeared, moving quietly to help her mother. She never looked at him now, not even by accident. Before, she had at least cast him shy glances, uncertain but curious. Now, her gaze was steel, avoiding him, refusing him. And yet, in her silence, he saw more truth than in all the false praises and honeyed words he had ever heard from those who once surrounded him. One evening, after a storm swept through the city, he found himself wandering the empty halls. The rain lashed against the windows, thunder rumbling in the distance, but inside, the house felt even lonelier than before. He paused outside the servants' quarters, where faint candlelight flickered through the crack under the door. He knew he should walk away, should leave them their privacy, but curiosity, no, something deeper, kept him rooted. Inside, the mother sat cross-legged on the floor, sewing torn hems into neat stitches. Her fingers were raw, the skin around her nails cracked from years of work. The girl sat beside her, reading aloud from her new book, her voice filling the tiny room with warmth that the storm outside couldn't dim. He leaned against the cold wall, listening. And though the kingdom was filled with riches, the princess did not envy gold or jewels. She only wanted freedom. Freedom to see the world beyond the palace gates. The girl read, her tone soft but alive. Her mother smiled faintly, not looking up from her sewing. And what would you do, my child, if you had that freedom? The girl's voice faltered for a moment. Then, with a spark that pierced through the walls, she whispered, I would study. I would learn. I would become someone who could help others like us. Someone who isn't ignored, who isn't laughed at. The mother placed her hand gently on the girl's head, brushing a loose strand of hair away. You already are more than that. You have a soul richer than anyone in this house. The man's chest tightened. He had heard countless speeches in boardrooms, words crafted to impress and manipulate. Yet these, simple, unpolished, spoken in a cramped room by two women with nothing, moved him more than any grand speech ever had. He walked away before they could sense him, retreating into his own chamber. But he could not sleep. Their words clung to him, pressing down like truth carved into stone. The next morning, he did something that startled even himself. He instructed his personal driver to prepare a delivery to the market. A box, he ordered curtly, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. Inside the box, he placed a selection of books from his private library, classics, histories, even novels he had never read. He had collected them as one collects trophies, decorations for shelves, symbols of culture he never had time to enjoy. To him, they were dust. To her, they could be doors. But he could not bring himself to hand them over personally. Pride and shame warred inside him. Instead, he instructed the driver to leave the box quietly at the entrance of the service quarters. No note, no explanation. That evening, as he returned from his business, he passed by their door and heard the faint gasp of the girl. Mama, look at all of this. The excitement in her voice sent a shiver down his spine. He slowed his steps, listening as the mother spoke softly. "Books, where did these come from?" The girl's laugh bubbled with joy. "It doesn't matter. Mama, look at the stories. Look at the pages. I've never seen so many at once." He pressed a hand against the wall, his breath shallow. He wanted to step inside, to admit what he had done, but his pride shackled him. So he kept walking, his face stern, but inside his chest, something fragile stirred. Over the next days, he began to notice more. The girl spent her evenings curled by the candlelight, reading aloud, her voice steady, alive. The mother smiled more, her tired eyes softening whenever she watched her daughter lose herself in the pages. But what struck him most were the little things. How the girl shared the books with other staff members, reading to the cook during breaks, showing the gardener how to trace letters with his finger. How the mother, instead of keeping the books hidden, allowed them to circulate among the workers, spreading quiet joy through the house. The man observed all of it from the shadows, his heart torn between admiration and regret. He had doubted them. He had humiliated them. Yet in return, they spread light into the darkest corners of his home. One night, unable to resist, he lingered outside their quarters again. He heard the girl's voice reciting a passage, then pausing to write something in her notebook. "Someday," she whispered, her pen scratching softly. "Someday I will write a book too. A book about us. About Mama. About how even people with nothing can still be rich here." There was a pause. He didn't see her gesture, but he felt it, her hand pressed against her chest, over her heart. The words nearly broke him. He turned away, retreating into the silent vastness of his mansion once more. For the first time in decades, he longed not for profit, not for victory, but for forgiveness. But forgiveness was not something money could buy. It was something he would have to earn, and he had no idea how. The mansion gleamed as always, every corner polished to perfection, but beneath its golden glow tension simmered. The man had begun to see everything differently. Where once he saw order, now he saw fear. Where once he saw loyalty, now he saw silence bought with wages too small. And where once he saw himself as the untouchable center of this empire, now he saw the cracks. It happened on a morning like any other. The staff moved briskly, preparing the dining hall. Silver trays gleamed, porcelain plates aligned with mathematical precision. He sat at the head of the table, as he always did, his eyes lowered to the steaming cup of coffee before him. The world saw power in this ritual, but inside, he felt only emptiness. And then the moment struck. The chief steward, a man with sharp features and a sharper tongue, marched into the room. He was ambitious, hungry for favor, the kind of man who thrived on whispers and accusations. His eyes darted toward the mother, who stood silently in the corner, her hands folded, awaiting her tasks. "There's been a theft," he announced loudly, his voice carrying through the hall. The clatter of silverware paused, heads turned. Several silver spoons are missing from the pantry, items of great value. A murmur rippled through the staff. The man at the head of the table lifted his eyes, cold and unreadable. The steward's gaze landed on the mother. He stepped forward, his finger pointing like a knife. "And who else has access to that room, if not her? Who cleans it? Who tidies the pantry every night? Who lingers there when the rest have left?" His tone dripped with false certainty. It must be her. The mother's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but no sound came at first. Then quietly but firmly, she whispered, "I've never stolen a thing in my life." The steward sneered, circling her like a predator. "Isn't that what they all say? And yet silver is gone. Missing. Convenient, isn't it? For someone who struggles to afford bread? For someone whose daughter clings to books as though they were gold." The girl, who had been wiping the far table, froze. Her hands tightened around the cloth, her knuckles white. Her eyes widened, her chest rising with shallow breaths. She looked toward her mother, her lips trembling. The mother's voice steadied, though her hands shook. "I would sooner starve than take what does not belong to me. My daughter knows this. Everyone here knows this." But the steward pressed on, his voice loud enough to carry into the hallways. Do we? Do we truly? Or have we all been blinded by her mask of humility? Isn't it possible she's been stealing in silence all these years? The girl stepped forward then, her voice breaking. Stop it. My mother would never. Silence. The steward snapped, cutting her off. Children should not speak when truth is being uncovered. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. She clutched her notebook against her chest, as though bracing herself. My mother is the most honest person in this house. She works harder than anyone. You can insult me if you wish, but do not accuse her. The room froze. All eyes flickered toward the head of the table, where the man sat. For years, he had allowed these moments to unfold without intervention, content to let his underlings fight their petty battles. His silence had always been a weapon, his indifference a shield. But now, as he looked at the mother standing accused, her dignity trembling under the weight of lies, something inside him broke. He remembered the night she had whispered for her daughter not to wake him, the nights she stitched torn clothes by candlelight, the mornings she carried baskets heavier than her frame. He remembered the girl's defiance, her courage, her words, "You will never own this." The accusation struck deeper than silver, deeper than theft. It was an insult to everything he had come to realize about them. He slammed his hand against the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The hall fell silent. Every head turned. Enough. His voice was cold, lethal, but it carried something new, something heavier. The steward faltered, blinking in surprise. But, sir, the evidence. There is no evidence. The man cut him off, rising slowly to his feet. His towering frame filled the room, his gaze piercing the steward until the man shrank back. You accuse without proof, and you dare humiliate her in front of this household. His voice sharpened. How many years has she served faithfully here? How many nights has she worked while you dined at ease? And you reward that with suspicion. The steward stammered, his ambition trembling into fear. I only thought. You thought wrong. His voice was thunder now. If silver is missing, then it is because you failed in your duties, not hers. Gasps rippled through the staff. The mother's eyes widened, tears brimming though she fought to hold them back. The girl clutched her notebook tighter, her lips parted in disbelief. The man's gaze softened just slightly as it turned to them. For the briefest moment, a flicker of something unguarded passed across his face. But he quickly masked it again, his tone returning to its icy edge. This woman is beyond reproach. Let there be no mistake. The steward bowed his head, humiliated, retreating into the shadows with murmured apologies. The hall remained frozen in silence until the man returned to his chair, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling with controlled fury. But inside, something shifted. For the first time in years, he had used his power not to crush, not to intimidate, but to defend. And the weight of that choice left him shaken. The mother lowered her gaze, tears slipping down her cheeks. The girl reached for her hand, their fingers entwining in silent strength. And for the first time, she dared to glance at him directly, her eyes glistening with something he could not name. Gratitude, perhaps, but tempered by caution. He looked away, his hand tightening around the cup before him. But his heart, long frozen, had begun to thaw. That night, the mansion was eerily quiet. The storm of accusation had passed, but its echoes lingered in every corridor. Servants whispered about what had happened, shocked that the master had defended the maid so fiercely. Some saw it as mercy, others as weakness. But for the man himself, it was neither. It was necessity, a truth forced out of him by the injustice he had witnessed. He sat alone in his study, the fire crackling weakly in the hearth. For the first time in years, he felt restless in his own skin. He had silenced the steward, yes, but he had not silenced the voice inside him. The girl's wide, tear-brimmed eyes, the mother's trembling composure, both haunted him. They had looked at him differently today. Not with fear, not with hatred, but with something worse, uncertainty. Do they believe me? He thought bitterly. Do they think I only defended them because it suited me? He leaned back in his chair, staring at the shelves lined with books he had never opened. How ironic it was that he owned thousands of words he had never read, while the girl clung to a single notebook as though it were life itself. The fire popped, spitting embers. His mind wandered back to the faces of those he had pushed away, his brother, his secretary, his chauffeur. People he had discarded because suspicion had convinced him loyalty was impossible. And now, for the first time, he longed to undo those choices. But ghosts cannot be called back. The only thing left was the present. The only thing left was them. The next morning, he rose earlier than usual. Instead of summoning his staff to serve him, he walked quietly through the mansion, his steps measured. He passed by the kitchen, where the mother worked silently, kneading dough with her weary hands. The girl sat at the wooden table, her head bent over her notebook, writing furiously as strands of hair fell across her face. He lingered at the doorway, unseen for a moment. The girl was whispering the words she wrote, shaping sentences carefully, her lips moving with determination. Her mother glanced at her occasionally, pride softening her tired features. It was a scene of simple beauty, so human it almost hurt to watch. Finally, he stepped into the room. The air shifted instantly. The mother straightened, her hands dusted with flour, her face carefully composed. The girl snapped her notebook shut, clutching it to her chest, her eyes wary. He cleared his throat and used to hesitation. "Good morning." The words sounded foreign in his mouth, clumsy, as though he had stolen them from someone else. The mother dipped her head slightly. "Good morning, sir." The girl said nothing, her eyes fixed on him, a silent shield of distrust. He hesitated, his gaze flicking between them. "I owe you both an apology." The girl blinked, startled, but her expression remained guarded. The mother's hands froze on the dough, her breath catching. In all their years under his roof, they had never heard such words from him. "I judged you unfairly," he continued, forcing the words out like stones dragged from deep within. "I let suspicion cloud my eyes. And yesterday, when that man accused you, I realized how wrong I've been." His voice cracked slightly, but he steadied it. "You have served this house with more loyalty than most who have stood beside me in business or blood. I see that now." The silence was unbearable. He had spoken, but their faces revealed nothing. The girl clutched her notebook tighter, her eyes narrowing as though weighing his sincerity. The mother bowed her head, her voice quiet but steady. "Words are easy, sir. Trust is harder." The truth of it struck him like a blade. He nodded slowly. "Then I will earn it." Somehow, the girl finally spoke, her tone sharp despite her trembling voice. "Why? Because you feel guilty? Or because you finally saw us bleed?" The question was a dagger, but he did not retreat from it. He met her gaze, his own steady. "Because I finally saw you live." The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. The girl looked away, her lips parting as though she wanted to argue, but no words came. The mother returned to kneading the dough, her hands slower now, thoughtful. He left them there, knowing he could not force forgiveness. But something had shifted, fragile and uncertain. For the first time, a bridge had been built, not a trust yet, but a possibility. That afternoon, he began small. In the garden, he ordered the gardener to plant roses along the path that led to the servants' quarters. "For beauty," he said curtly, though the gardener looked at him strangely. In the pantry, he instructed the cook to add extra portions to the meals, making sure there was enough for everyone. He even arranged for the steward's duties to be reassigned, demoting him quietly but firmly. The staff whispered. Change was in the air, though no one understood why. That evening, he saw the girl sitting beneath the window in the corridor, her book open on her knees, the fading light catching her face. She did not notice him at first. She was lost in the story, her lips curving into a faint smile. It was the first time he had seen her smile since the night she accused him of invading her dreams. He stood in the shadows, watching. Something unfamiliar stirred in him. Not pity, not guilt, something pure. A memory surfaced, his own childhood, long before the fortune, when he too had sat with a book by candlelight, dreaming of a world larger than his own. Before the betrayals, before the suspicions, before the walls he built around himself. For a moment, he felt like that boy again. And for the first time in years, he whispered to himself, maybe it isn't too late. Days unfolded like pages in a book no one had expected him to write. The mansion, once a monument to indifference, began to hum with subtle changes, tiny gestures that rippled outward. Fresh flowers in corners long forgotten, warmer meals at the servants' table, tools repaired and replaced without complaint. The staff whispered of miracles, but no one dared say his name aloud in connection with kindness. For years, he had been a storm, and storms did not simply soften. Yet the mother noticed. She saw the extra food, the repaired wardrobe door, the way the steward no longer lingered like a vulture. And though she did not speak of it, gratitude flickered behind her eyes, mingled with caution. She had lived long enough to know that change in men like him was fragile, dangerous, perhaps temporary. The girl, however, was harder to reach. She kept her distance, guarding her words, guarding her notebook, her fortress of dreams. But even she could not ignore the subtle cracks in his mask. She saw him pause sometimes in the hallways, his gaze lingering on her writing. She caught him once, standing by the garden, watching her read under the roses he had ordered planted. He said nothing, but his silence was different now. Not cold, not suspicious, but searching. One evening, the turning point arrived. The household had gathered in the grand hall for inspection, as was tradition at the end of each month. The man sat in his leather chair, high-backed, like a throne, his presence commanding as always. The steward, still nursing his humiliation, hovered at the side, bitterness seeping from every glance. The mother stood quietly with the other staff, her daughter at her side, clutching her notebook. The steward cleared his throat, loud enough to silence the room. Before we proceed, there is something that must be addressed. Productivity among the staff has declined. His words were venom wrapped in politeness, perhaps due to distractions. I have noticed the girl, his eyes cut to the daughter, spending hours scribbling in her book instead of assisting her mother. I fear she's becoming a burden. A ripple of murmurs swept through the servants. The girl's cheeks flamed red, her arms tightening around her notebook. Her mother reached for her hand, whispering, "Stay quiet," but her eyes burned with protective fury. The steward smirked, emboldened. If she insists on wasting time in childish fantasies, perhaps she should be sent away. Better that than infecting the household with laziness. The girl's lips parted, but fear silenced her. The mother opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. The weight of humiliation pressed down on them, heavier with every second of silence. And then, for the first time, the girl looked up, straight at him. Her voice trembled at first, but it carried through the hall. "I am not lazy." The steward scoffed. "Oh, and what do you call hiding in corners with that ridiculous notebook? You think words will fill plates? That stories will pay for bread." The girl's hands shook, but she stood taller, clutching her notebook like a weapon. Words are not useless. Stories are not worthless. They are hope. They are strength. And if you call me a burden for dreaming, then I would rather be a burden than a coward who crushes others. Gasps rippled through the hall. No one had ever dared speak back to the steward like that. The man at the head of the room felt his chest tighten. Pride, raw and unexpected, burned inside him. The steward's face twisted with rage. "How dare you?" But before he could finish, the man rose to his feet. His chair scraped against the marble, echoing like thunder. His voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Enough." The room froze. His eyes locked on the steward, his tone colder than steel. "You will not speak to her like that. You will not speak to any of them like that." The steward stammered, his confidence crumbling. "But sir, she is the daughter of the most loyal servant this house has ever known." The man interrupted, his voice steady and unyielding. "And she is more courageous than most men I have met in boardrooms and battlefields alike." The girl's eyes widened. Her mother covered her mouth, tears brimming. The rest of his staff stood in stunned silence. The steward tried one last desperate protest. "But sir, discipline must be maintained." "Discipline," the man thundered, "is not cruelty. And if you cannot tell the difference, then you no longer belong here." The hall gasped as his words fell like a hammer. The steward paled, bowing stiffly, and retreated without another word. The man stood there for a long moment, his gaze sweeping the room. The staff lowered their eyes, trembling, unsure what this new version of their master meant for them. But the mother and daughter met his gaze directly. For the first time, there was no hatred, no defiance, only stunned disbelief and something fragile stirring beneath it. The girl hugged her notebook tighter, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak. But she said nothing. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes was enough. For the first time since he could remember, he felt seen. That night, in the solitude of his study, he replayed the scene over and over. Her trembling voice, her courage, the way she had defended herself, her dreams in front of everyone, and the way he had defended her in turn. It was then he realized he was no longer simply trying to prove them wrong. He was trying to prove himself worthy of the faith he had never given anyone. For the first time in decades, he wanted not power, not victory, but redemption. And redemption, he knew, would require more than words. It would require his heart. The days that followed were unlike any the mansion had ever known. Whispers of change filled every corridor. Servants moved with less fear in their steps. Laughter began to appear in corners where silence once reigned, and even the air itself felt lighter. Yet amidst it all, one question remained unanswered. Would trust, broken so violently, ever truly be mended? The man knew the answer could not be forced. And so, for once in his life, he chose patience. He watched quietly, listening more than speaking, learning more than judging. He saw the mother's steady perseverance, the way she worked with quiet dignity even when no one seemed to notice. He saw the girl's growing confidence, how she dared to read aloud in front of the others now, her words painting dreams across the dull walls of the servants' quarters. But he also saw the shadows, the way the girl still clutched her notebook tightly whenever he passed, the way her eyes still carried the weight of betrayal, the way her mother, though softened by gratitude, never let her guard fully drop. He realized then that redemption required more than small gestures. It required a truth, a naked truth that could no longer hide behind suspicion or pride. It happened one evening when the sun was bleeding into the horizon, painting the sky in gold and crimson. He called them to the grand hall, not as master summoning servants, but as a man summoning those he had wronged. The mother hesitated at the doorway, the girl by her side, notebook clutched as always. "Come," he said softly, a word that seemed almost foreign in his mouth. They stepped forward cautiously, the vastness of the hall swallowing their small figures. He stood not on the dais, not in his chair, but on the marble floor at their level. "I have spent my life building walls," he began, his voice deep but unsteady. "Walls of suspicion, walls of wealth, walls to keep betrayal out. But in building them, I kept out something far more precious, trust." The mother's eyes flickered, uncertain. The girl held her breath, watching him closely. He continued, his tone growing heavier. "I doubted you both. I tested you in cruelty. I read what was not mine to read. And in doing so, I revealed not your flaws, but mine. You showed me honesty where I expected lies. You showed me humility where I expected greed. And you showed me dreams where I believed there could only be schemes." His voice cracked, but he pressed on. "I was wrong. And for that, I ask your forgiveness, not as your master, but as a man who has lived too long without a heart." The silence that followed was immense. The mother lowered her gaze, her lips trembling. The girl's eyes shone with something fierce, anger still, but softened by the weight of his words. At last, the girl stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. "Why now? After all this time, why should we believe you?" He looked at her, and for once there was no mask, only truth. "Because you taught me what wealth cannot buy. Because your words, your courage, opened my eyes. And because if I do not change now, then I am already poorer than anyone alive." The girl's grip on her notebook loosened. Slowly, she opened it, flipping to a page filled with sketches of houses, gardens, fields. She held it out, trembling. "These are my dreams. I don't share them with anyone. But if you mean what you say, then you'll protect them, not take them." His hand trembled as he accepted the book. He did not open it. He pressed it against his chest, over his heart, and whispered, "They are yours. Always." Then, after a long pause, he returned it to her, bowing his head, not as a master, but as a man humbled. The girl's breath caught. Her eyes glistened, and for the first time, she did not clutch the notebook away from him. Instead, she whispered, "Then maybe we could try to trust you." The mother stepped closer, her hand resting gently on her daughter's shoulder. Her voice broke softly. "We will not forget what has passed, but we will remember this moment too." The man's throat tightened, "And I will spend the rest of my days proving worthy of it." From that day forward, the mansion changed, not with grand announcements or extravagant gifts, but with small, steady acts of respect. The mother no longer bowed her head when she entered a room. He insisted she meet his eyes. The girl no longer hid her notebook in shadows. She read her words aloud in the garden, her voice strong, her dreams blooming among the roses. And one evening, as the girl read aloud to the household under the fading light, the man stood at the edge of the gathering, silent, listening. His heart, once a fortress of suspicion, now swelled with something he had nearly forgotten existed: peace. He had tested them once, expecting betrayal. Instead, he had found purity, and in their humility, they had tested him in return. And though he was the master of the house, it was he who had been saved. A bond was forged that night, not of wealth, not of power, but of trust. A bond that proved that sometimes the greatest fortune is found not in gold, but in the unbreakable dignity of those who have nothing. And now I turn to you, dear listener. What would you do if your trust was tested this way? Do you believe that humility and honesty still exist in this world? Let me know in the comments from which city you are watching this story. Don't forget to subscribe, because here you will always find stories that touch the heart and remind us of what truly matters.